Welcome everybody to part 2 of episode 4 of the Risk 4.0 video blog series. Now in this two-parter we have been exploring the 12 months so far of the coronavirus phenomenon. Specifically we've been looking at it from the point of view of resilience and asking a number of questions around have the decisions we made and the tactical actions that we've implemented helped us to become more resilient to this pandemic. Now, in the first episode, we specifically explored the period leading up to March 2020 when we had the first wave, and we came up with our first lesson for the session, and that was we cannot wait for known macro threats to escalate into crisis. We need to proactively plan for and monitor them. And we base this on the fact that when we went into lockdown, we experienced a number of harsh impacts. Unemployment went through the roof, revenue and earnings went through the floor, and we saw some of the greatest volatility in history in most of our stock markets. And what this actually taught us is that the first lockdown period actually revealed that not only are we vulnerable to the pandemic threat, but we are also vulnerable to our chosen control. In other words, mass scale hard lockdown. So by May, June 2020, we found ourselves in an incredibly unique position where not only had our control decisions not eradicated the virus, but they had created numerous other potentially catastrophic global threats, which now needed to be dealt with in parallel. So I want to build on this in this particular session and talk about the remaining 9 months of that 12-month period. So after we locked down the first time and we were able to actually flatten the curve and get things back to a relative state of normality, it became clear we now needed to start planning our road to recovery. A lot of academic discussion was had around about this time, but most people seem to agree that there needs to be three primary goals of whatever our road to recovery would be. And the first one was that we needed to protect the vulnerable. The second goal would be that we needed to get the healthy back to work in a safe manner. And the third one is that we needed to address our systemic vulnerabilities. And basically what that argument was that the reason that coronavirus had impacted us so harshly was because our existence retained numerous systemic vulnerabilities which made us weak in the presence of the pandemic. So part of our coronavirus recovery strategy needed to be addressing that which made us weak to the pandemic. So it was around about this time that a number of academic institutions and thought tanks started actually mulling potential options for a road to recovery. And in Australia specifically, the Group of 8 was formed, and this was 8 leading academic institutions and universities. And what they actually did was develop a open paper called the Roadmap to Recovery, a report for the nation, which they submitted to government and to big business. And this laid out a number of options for what our roadmap to recovery might look like. Now, it wasn't just Australia, a number of other countries did it, and basically 3 sort of options made it to the table. So Model A said we need to eliminate the virus through extended social isolation and keep blocking down and shutting down. Model B said we need to manage the virus through better societal controls and systems. So this was about actually adapting to make us more resilient. And Model C said let's just allow the epidemic to run its natural course through the population, a la herd immunity. Now, if we measure these 3 models against the actual objectives, straight away, almost instantaneously, Model C was discounted. And the reason being that it didn't meet any of the objectives. And so, pretty much universal agreement, Model C herd immunity was not going to work. So it now became a case of Model A versus Model B. And this is where a lot of the academic thought and discussion was going roughly May, June, July in 2020. And the comparisons between these 2 models looked as such. So in terms of protecting the vulnerable, both of them agreed, improved sample testing, case tracing and quarantining of the sick. In terms of getting people back to work healthily, everybody agreed, but we need to enforce COVID-safe work behaviors, masks, sanitizer, social distancing and such. Where the key difference was the third part, addressing our systemic vulnerabilities. And this is where the major differences were. In the case of Model A actually wasn't focusing about addressing our existing vulnerabilities. Rather, it was about adopting lockdowns and isolations as our preferred control until either a cure is secured or the virus itself is eliminated. In other words, lockdown until the virus is no longer an issue. All right? Model B was a much more intense approach. It said what we need to do is actively modify our societal systems and personal behaviors to improve our resilience to the virus. All right? And this included protecting the vulnerable, quarantining the sick, enforcing COVID-safe behaviors and avoid locking down the healthy, which was something that more than 90% have said. So these two bottom points became sticking points. The concept of enforcing COVID-safe behaviors, everybody agreed that if everybody practiced COVID-safe behaviors, we shouldn't have a second wave, and therefore we shouldn't have to lock down. The problem was enforcing it. I'm not sure how the decision was made, but I think we came to agreement that it was going to be easier to lock people down in mass quantities and make them stay at home than it would be to actively enforce COVID-safe behaviors. We weren't going to be able to get millions of people to practice COVID-safe behavior. So for some reason, we started saying that they couldn't be trusted, and this became a bit of a contentious point. Equally, the concept of not locking down the healthy 90% also became contentious. And I'm not sure exactly how it happened, but it started becoming clear that we were leaning towards Model A, and any model that didn't allow for locking down started becoming arguable and contentious. And case in point, a very specific example that I'd like to show to demonstrate this is the case of Sweden. So round about March, Sweden chose not to lock down. They chose to take a much looser approach to this, and for their non-lockdown strategy, they were absolutely crucified in the press. I mean, it became an unnatural obsession. Every other day there was a paper being written or a media journal article being written about how Sweden was a catastrophic failure. Now, I don't say that their model was perfect. There were definitely things that they should have been done properly. There were definitely things they should have done better. But as an academic and a risk professional, I really struggle with the argument that their model was a catastrophic failure, because there's no scientific basis for that argument. And allow me to elaborate. I want to spend a bit of time just setting the record straight about Sweden, because I believe this became a fixation, a little bit of bias, and a lot of fallacy. So setting the record straight. First thing that we have to know is that Sweden was not the only country on the planet that chose to not lock down in March. Something like half the world didn't lock down in March, but Sweden was the only one we were criticizing, so that was kind of odd. The argument that Sweden's fatality rate should have mirrored its immediate neighbors, and I'm sorry, but that has no scientific validity. I mean, that's like arguing that all Asian countries should have the same fatality rates because they have similar cultural behavior. Now, of course, we can't make such a claim, because every geography has specific complexities and differentiating factors, such as demographics, population size, travel distances, topography, and cultural behavior. So no three geographies are actually comparable. There are simply too many differences. But again, if you subscribe to the fact that countries can be compared, I don't, but if you believe that, well, then we have to acknowledge the next point, and that is, despite not locking down, Sweden's fatality rates had remained consistently lower than many lockdown countries, including their European neighbors, Belgium, Spain, Italy, UK, France, and most recently Switzerland. So even despite not locking down, Sweden wasn't the worst in the world. They were beating many, many other lockdown countries, including many of their European neighbors. So again, I just don't get how we can say they were a catastrophic failure. Anyway, moving on. The challenge that we now had was that if anybody said we should adopt or consider a non-lockdown option, or if we should consider radically enforcing COVID-safe behavior, everybody just pointed to Sweden and said, look, they tried to do it in Sweden, which is not true. That's not what Sweden tried to do. But Sweden became the case study for discrediting any model that didn't allow for lockdown. So pretty soon, Model B started getting discounted or became discounted, and all we were left with Model A. Now, what that basically meant was that we went through a remission period, and because we chose to persist with a model that preferred lockdowns rather than societal transformation, it meant that it was inevitable that a second wave would emerge within many countries, as we had actually done relatively little during the remission period to prevent a second wave. So building on this, I believe that our second lesson learned is that a post-event recovery plan needs to also focus on addressing those inherent vulnerabilities which created the initial weakness, so as to avoid future exposures. Now, personally, I believe that not adopting Model B back in June was a lost opportunity, as it would have paved the way to making our society more resilient, not just to this pandemic, but to all future pandemics, and possibly even all future macro threats. That's the direction we needed to be moving. But the fact is right now it actually doesn't really matter, because in November a game-changing hallelujah moment came along when at least 3 workable vaccines were announced as being ready for mass deployment, all in the same week. read into that what you will. But the fact is that we now find we find ourselves now in a situation where we actually have a number of workable vaccines at our disposal, and they're starting to be distributed and they're starting to be used. Now, don't get me wrong, there is no doubt a vaccine has a positive aspect to it. It will definitely save lives, and it will almost certainly allow us to go back to a relatively normal state sooner rather than later. However, what the vaccine won't do is eradicate those systemic societal vulnerabilities which exposed us to COVID-19 in the first place. So now that an actual workable vaccine is available, it's almost certain that Model A type lockdowns will become the preferred control choice for many countries, and they will almost certainly persist with lockdown until their citizens are immunized. So for the immediate future, we are now almost certainly trapped in a lockdown Model A type scenario. But what about the long-term future? Where do we go from here? Well, perhaps one of the great positives that did come out of the last 12 months was the initiation of the World Economic Forum's Great Reset campaign. And basically the World Economic Forum recognized what I've been talking about for a while, is that in order for our society to become resilient to macro global threats, we are going to have to transform. We're going to have to transform our systems and our personal behaviors to eradicate many of those weaknesses and vulnerabilities which are exposing us to macro global threats. And what the World Economic Forum campaign aims to do is to publish on a regular basis articles and videos which show some of the roadmaps that we can adopt both at business level and at government level to make us resilient to future macro threats. So if we go through here, it's a fantastic website. It has numerous videos and articles which you can actually download and read. Here's a couple that are currently trending. But essentially what these all tell us is that if we want to improve our resilience to macro global threats, we are going to have to transform. So I believe over the last 12 months, 3 primary lessons have emerged from our coronavirus experience for managing future macro threats. And the first lesson we discussed in episode 1, and that is we cannot wait for known macro threats to escalate into crisis. We have to proactively plan for and monitor them. Lesson 2, a post-event recovery plan needs to also focus on addressing the inherent vulnerabilities which created the initial weakness so as to avoid future exposures. And what the World Economic Forum is teaching us about the future is that lesson 3 is that long-term resilience to macro threats cannot be achieved without the host ecosystem undergoing some fundamental degree of genuine transformational change. And this seems to be the part over the last 12 months that seems to be missing. We haven't wanted to change. We've wanted to beat coronavirus without adopting any form of change. And that's not resilience. Resilience is about changing to suit the environmental circumstances. So at the end of the day, when all is said and done, the key question we now have to ask is, after 12 months of all this unpleasantness, after all the mass deaths and suffering, have the choices we made and the actions we have engaged in made us any more resilient to pandemics than we were 12 months ago? When the next pandemic comes, or whatever next macro global threat may be, will we be better prepared and more intelligently responsive? I mean, this is the fundamental question of the last 12 months. So in review for me, and from my personal observation point, I believe that in the last 12 months, at no point were we ever proactively mitigating the risk of the coronavirus. Rather, it seemed all we were ever doing was reactively responding to the escalating crisis caused by the virus. And after all is said and done, we haven't yet addressed what needed to be addressed in order to make us more resilient to such macro threats. And so for this reason, I feel we are no less vulnerable to pandemics and all the other macro threats out there than we were a year ago, before the corona phenomena started. And I've got to be honest, that worries me a little bit, because our macro global threats are not getting any less momentous or fatalistic. And that's probably a good segue, which brings us to the topic of the next episode. So I hope you enjoyed this particular episode and I gave you something to think about. You don't have to agree with what it, just hear me out and think about it for yourself. But what I'm building to is that in this new complex, disruptive, modern working world that we're living in, is that there are certain classes of risk that are only getting bigger, more momentous, and more fatalistic every generation. And pandemics is one of them, but most macro threats fall into it. Now, this is a very specific terminology in scientific terms. It's known as regression to the tail. And this is the concept I want to introduce you to next episode. And in future episodes, we're going to start talking a little bit about some of the more scientific concepts that are out there which should be informing our modern day risk management. So thank you for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something. And I look forward to discussing risk in the next episode with you. So until then, keep safe. Thank you.